some of the biggest decolonial thinkers of our time often come from the 50s, 70s, Fanon, Biko, Césaire, amongst others. They have this sharp analytical clarity that we still rely on today. This sense of collective possibility embedded in what they talk about, because they were operating in the immediate context of formal decolonization, many within active liberation movements and often under direct state violence even. So when you fast forward to our generation, we now have access to not only their texts, but decades of scholarship that followed. We have global communication networks, new analytical frameworks. We can connect across borders much quicker to share and document in real time injustices as they happen. And yet it feels more fragmented and even more performative in some ways, where we often cycle through critique without clear pathways towards transformation. And I'm not trying to romanticize that earlier generation, but I'm curious about the differences in what shifted in how colonial power operates, and therefore what needs to shift in how we address it, because it's not also just copy and paste what they did back then, even though their knowledge and what they shared is still super important and useful today. So how do you read this kind of generational difference in addressing colonialism? What are some of the specific conditions shaping how our generation engages with decolonization differently than that mid-20th century generation did?
I think there's a few things we need to maintain the context of. So the first is that the mid-century movements were dominated by people who lived through war, who lived through the times of independence from the colonizers, especially across the global south. So those decades especially was fresh essentially from a militarized attitude towards defense of sovereignty and this feeling of we can fight for our freedom. Our freedom is in reach if we simply come together and throw numbers at it, essentially. So there was a cultural movement essentially that was more open to militarization, was more open to rebellion, was more open to strategizing together, collaborating together, organizing together, despite, whatever limitations they might have had, for example, in terms of resource or in terms of political power. And the second aspect I would say is that propaganda warfare had not yet been launched, essentially, to the degree that the US hegemon would have started launching propaganda warfare in all nations across the world. So when we combine those two things, we can see that local movements had more power to control local movements. And there was less interference from Western powers in terms of propaganda, narrative control, political influence, foreign policy agenda, etc. So I think we have to see this in the geopolitical and economic context of those times. Because as soon as I say those things and I point those things out, you can see how that's a very different context from where we are today. And not only today, but in the decades since then. So going from the 80s, 90s, the noughties, and then today, we have a very different set of circumstances that are entirely dominated by a US information space, entirely dominated by divide and conquer through social media. And so we have been essentially like half a generation, right? Manipulated, especially our older generations who are supposed to be the wisest political demographic, having lived through many presidents, many prime ministers, many changes of, global opinion on certain countries, etc. They are stuck in Facebook. They are stuck gossiping or like, sharing clips that they don't know are made from AI with their grandchildren or something. This essentially is very effective at taking them out of political discussions. And in many ways, I think this sort of splintering of national discourse into these different generations, different exploiting different susceptibilities and different pleasure centers is extremely effective at taking out the population's ability to experience the same problems and then come together and organize to address those problems together. So it is this same mechanism that essentially leads nation states to being run amok by their ruling classes, right? Because of the distractions that come into play. That's my experience, and that's the only way that I feel I can explain how, even in times of extreme turmoil and suffering, people are not coming together to fix their own problems. They are instead suffering in silence, essentially, oftentimes because they believe that the problems are their own, and they themselves need to work hard themselves to fix their own problems. So instead of seeing things on a systemic level or political level, they simply say, why should I vote? Because the system is corrupt anyway.
Mhm.
So this is simply like a divide and conquer mechanism that has been extremely successful in order to destabilize the possibility of societies to organize, to rebel. And then we have another mechanism, especially rising in the 70s, of capitalism, in which we are all enslaved to money. And this has only exacerbated since the decoupling of the US dollar from gold. And when we're talking about essentially, again, the US deciding or manipulating or controlling the value of money, then they're essentially dictating how much and how far we are enslaved in order to expand the globalization project, in which here I am referring to economic globalization, especially where supply chains are globalized in order to take advantage of anything from low land cost to low labor cost to low shipping cost, etc. When you combine all of these factors that we are presently engaged in today, you can see that back at the time of Fanon, Biko, Césaire, they did not have to grapple with all of these things. I'm not even mentioning anything with regards to millennials or avocado toast or house prices. Like, let's not even go there, right? We're simply just talking about the global political and economic context within which we exist today compared to during that era. That is enough to explain, I think, much of the difference.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I think it's a completely different context, and it is important to have that critical filtering of understanding how to separate that, because I see a lot of people relying on these marks, but without doing the critical thinking of, okay, how is the context different and how just copying and pasting kind of thing won't work. So, and I think there are, as you said, many shifts in how the decolonial movements were fighting for sovereignty, especially from these external powers in this formal decolonization movements that were happening back there, while now we are fighting against this system that have learned to wear many masks of progress, of diversity, and even liberation itself. And we are much more internally colonized through decades of that self-reinforcing patterns that we have already discussed in the other videos of the Stockholm syndrome, the powerlessness, etc. I think the first challenge is not everyone sees this as something that we need to unite on against, because a lot of people still think that colonialism ended, that we are free, that our current conditions are just how things are, or even seeing it as progress. So the system operates through our own complicity, through making us believe that we are choosing freely when our choices have been narrowed by the centuries of conditioning. And so there is this pre-work kind of understanding this and to purge this programming that lives inside of us first, which requires constant vigilance and willingness to walk away from these opportunities that compromise integrity, which, as you said, with propaganda and all of that, kind of reinforced. It's kind of a self-reinforcing system. And I think there's also the question of timing and pace, because the earlier generation, they were immersed in their like daily lives, and they could see some progress of liberation in their lifetimes. So a lot of them did see formal independence. And now we have these compounded layers of planetary systems collapse, power structures that have refined themselves over generations. So the work will probably take lifetimes. And I think that in itself also requires a different relationship to time and outcomes that we expect from this.
In many ways, I think we can see our present day condition is actually a result of the failures of the decolonial movement during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because that was the moment, as you said, that nation states were not as well established, the political classes were not as well established, the economic realities in global south was not as well established. We didn't have those sorts of widespread trade policies that are dictated by the IMF, World Bank, etc. And we had more resources in the ground at that time to actually leverage and bargain with, right? So when we're talking about the context within the experience of those writers, we have to look at the context today and the experience of writers today, because it's not that there's no one, right? There are many people who are making great points. It's just that they are now part of the captured academia, the vast majority of them. Everything that they published is published in a controlled space, controlled by Western hegemon, and their salaries come from the Western hegemon as well. And they might think that they're making big contributions to the decolonial movement because it's published in a journal, but they, I don't know, rarely seem to question that this journal is a colonial enterprise in itself. And they choose comfort of being paid well, of not having to militarize, of being able to sit in an office and wear nice clothes and have, central heating or whatever, and not being uncomfortable in a resistance movement in which, we're not sure if people can get fed today, for example. They call that resistance, especially in the global north these days, right? And this is entirely part of liberal hegemony, in which there is a Western mode of resistance, of rebellion, which is comfortable for the hegemon, comfortable for the colonial world order, because it already controls that mode. This is the same mode that promotes nonviolence, because obviously they don't want to be dealing with violent militant movements of billions of people across the global south taking up arms or abandoning capitalism or globalization wholesale, which is kind of happening now with BRICS, right? You have nation states actually abandoning the globalization project. The international rules-based order collapses under the weight of the imploding hegemon. We need to also look at the courage of the writers, or the ability of the writers themselves to step outside of the bubbles that hold them in. And unfortunately, today it takes so much creativity and so much grit and talent and connections to get to a point where your voice can actually travel somewhere. Because if you do anything on social media, it's, facing an algorithm which is looking for you to shadow ban you. If you publish a book, the same thing. You have to appease a publisher who has a particular kind of like brand to protect, and obviously a profit target to make. There are much fewer places now where somebody of great courage would actually have to be creative enough to pursue. And then I also have to mention that the European Union has, as in the last few years, started to sanction individuals, even in the West, simply for countering the narratives of the Western hegemon, despite the fact that they are factually backed up and accredited even by their own institutions. For example, somebody who retired from NATO, who started writing against what the US, the UK, and Israel, for example, are doing in Ukraine against Russia. I'm talking about Jacques Beau, who was just a few weeks ago sanctioned individually as a political project by the leaders of the European Union. So these elements, I think, are very much real in terms of the political blackmail, the sabotage, the individual targeting. I'm sure that even if someone in academia had the support of their university, right, to pursue a certain line of argumentation that was extremely critical of the West, either they would be allowed and their work would basically never been shown anywhere,
Mhm.
or they would have then been taught a lesson by the university. For example, there would be a lawsuit against you for someone accusing you of pedophilia or something like that. And they might plant evidence somewhere, etc. So various efforts of lawfare, of blackmail, etc. These sorts of things are underway where your name, even though it might not be very well known, is absolutely being targeted by some national security agenda somewhere. And no one will ever know about it. It will not stay in the record because you're not famous enough for the media to care about. And anyway, the media is not going to report it because that would be counterproductive for national security. I don't think Fanon experienced those things at that time. People might have known his name in, various intelligentsia, but the kind of like budget to go after those types of people was relatively low compared to the budget that was being directed towards actual militant rebellion.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we live in a different world today.
Yeah, I think that there is this trap for many indigenous movements that are really still have a lot of the elements, let's say, like haven't been so corrupted by this internalized colonization yet, and still have that strong sense of community by living within, like, and still share that intergenerational knowledge transmission and traditional experiences and thinking and being. But when it comes to the bridge between their community and the colonial power and trying to protect their lands and their community, then it gets really dangerous and hard not to be co-opted or to be appropriated or used as this kind of token figure. What normally happens is either that bridge is someone from the community that has a bit more of experience with outside of doing that communication, either like someone who left the community to go to a university or go sometimes like has a bit of this contact and context to be that bridge, which makes sense, like someone who knows a bit more the inside of this beast to be able to do this communication. But then, because this person has been introduced to this world, also gets seduced by the opportunities, by, being seen, by having the space to talk and having that recognition. And I think then it enters into a spiral of you speak at this event or you speak here, and then you are invited to this other thing and this other thing. So it's again the distraction mechanism of feeling like there's some progress, but nothing comes back to like there's no substantial change that comes back often. Or if it is someone that is a leader of that community, that has no contact to this world, then there is this kind of innocence of naivety that also sets its own traps. So it's a very hard terrain to navigate, to not be co-opted and not be appropriated and not be, tricked. How are you going to cooperate with this thing versus how you're going to combat, but then you don't have the enough resources, or like fighting a Godzilla with stones or sticks. Like there's no way, like you don't have the resources to do that. It's super complex and difficult to navigate that as well, because I think it is a systematic destruction, because these indigenous communities were through centuries decimated through the four colonial harms that we talk about: ecocide, ethnocide, epistemicide, ethnocide. So, and now the colonial powers have much more control and power than when you look at how these communities and thinkers in their own nations were organizing against colonial powers, that they were in much higher numbers and had, like, the community was so much stronger.
Yeah.